Today on Kitchen Sink Dharma, the invitation is to slow down a little as you listen. I'm going to talk about a shift in perspective, and today's about accessing a slightly different way of seeing the world, a different way of relating to our experience, so not relating to it from a place of separation, but from a place of belonging. And I want to talk about how sometimes we can actually sense our connection to something bigger than us. Doing this isn't necessarily going to address the deeper roots of our suffering, but it can be really helpful, especially if it helps us to become more steady, if it gives us some stability, and if it helps us to drop some of our resistance and stop fighting against reality. It might also help us to relax into the flow of life. Now, there's many different ways of looking at the world, and our experience really depends entirely on how we look at the world. Rob Burbea, who was a Dharma teacher, wrote his wonderful book, Seeing That Frees, and it's about exactly this, and he suggested that the way that things appear always depends on how we look at them, and that we can experiment a bit with perception. And by seeing the world from a different angle, we can actually free ourselves. Now, another person I've been reading recently is the psychiatrist Iain McGilchrist, and he's written about the different functions of each hemisphere of the brain, the left and right hemisphere, and he describes how each hemisphere offers us a completely different experiential world. This is from his book. There is one world in which everything is isolated, fragmentary, static, known, familiar, inanimate, decontextualized, relatively abstract, general in nature, and wholly explicit. And there is another world in which everything is interconnected, flowing and changing all the time, is never ultimately certain and always needs to be considered in context. The first way of seeing is like a map. The second is like the territory, which is an infinitely more complex, beautiful reality. So that's from the book The Matter with Things by Iain McGilchrist. One of the problems in our culture is that it favours the map at the expense of the territory. It favours the way of looking at things that breaks them up and decontextualises them, rather than seeing everything as a whole. And we spend a lot of the day looking at the world as a collection of separate things. And we look at the world with a sense of certainty, like we know what we're seeing. And we see everything as existing in isolation, each thing having its own essential nature. And that means that the state of our consciousness is often one of labelling and controlling. But it isn't always like that. Sometimes we experience a shift in our perspective, and it might be an appreciation of our interconnectedness, might be a melting away of the sense of separation, might even just be an opening up, into a sense of spaciousness that offers absolutely no resistance to whatever it encounters. And these shifts in perspective really only reveal themselves to us when we're receptive to them. So instead of integrating these insights into our worldview, we tend to shut them down, we tend to discount them, and that means that we miss a lot. And one of the things that we miss is the degree to which everything is part of one big system. So we know the world through our senses, and we process all that sense data with our minds. And much of the time the world appears to be made up of millions of separate things, but we miss the reality that it's one big connected system. And we see ourselves as something that exists inside of us, and everything else is existing outside of us, usually some distance apart from us. And we feel cut off from everything else. But we're really not that separate. We're really not separate at all from the rest of existence. We're more like waves in the sea than separate islands. So waves contain water, but they move along, they leave the water behind. They're more of an energetic movement, they're a process. And they don't have any real boundary. And energy and matter passes through them, which is exactly what happens with us. Energy and matter passes through us. They come together, they come apart. And our identity is something that arises from all of this. And it appears, and there's a sense of continuity, just as there is with a wave. But really it's just another process. Really our sense of identity is just something that we're constantly maintaining and building and weaving. It's not a solid thing. So when we open up to an understanding of process and understanding of flow, we start to see that the self isn't a thing. We don't have a thing called the self. Self is an activity. Our beliefs, our stories, our anxieties, our memories and so on, all of that gets woven into a sense of self. And then the sense of self feels very real and solid. And we tend to react a lot and become defensive when we think it's being threatened. And we put a lot of energy into maintaining it, but it isn't actually a thing. And when we look behind that sense of self, we find something else entirely. We find peace. We find bliss. And when I say bliss, I'm not talking about happiness. It's about something that's not the same as happiness, because happiness comes and goes, only lasts for a few seconds. Happiness will keep coming and going. It'll keep arising and disappearing, whether or not we're looking for it. Peace, on the other hand, is our natural state. It's always there, but it's obscured by the constant search for happiness. And peace is something that appears in the absence of agitation, the absence of a sense that something's missing. To a large extent, our search for happiness is actually our suffering. And we live in this constant, often subtle, sometimes not so subtle state of conflict. And early Buddhist teachings talk about dukkha, often translated as suffering, but it really means rejecting what's happening right now. And we tend to think of happiness as a place that we can reach. We think of it as a stable state, and we can objectify it. Sometimes we turn it into a project. Happiness isn't a thing. It's not made up of any solid matter. It's just a fleeting, momentary feeling, and it comes and goes. And as soon as it goes, we want more. So the whole project of chasing after happiness is bound to fail. But peace and bliss, these things are natural to us. They're our natural state. And they're what happens if we let the barriers, if we let the obstacles fall away. What we find is simple, loving awareness. And then we discover nothing's missing. Any sense of incompleteness or insufficiency just fades away. And this is harder than it sounds. Of course it is. The mind that we've grown up with tends to be more concerned with safety and survival and comfort rather than joy or meaning. And it tries to hold on to things. It tries to control. It tries to manipulate. And these activities of avoiding and seeking, they run on in the background, even when they're not needed. We're always looking for what's missing, in very overt ways sometimes, in very subtle ways sometimes. We're wired to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. And we have this reward system that's permanently unsatisfied. And it's not our fault. It serves an evolutionary purpose. And when the reward system gets hijacked by habits, it drives us demented. But we don't have to live that way. We have other ways of relating to our world. We've got other ways of seeing our world, like opening up to the whole sense of wholeness that comes from knowing, comes from feeling that we're not separate from the world. We can only do this if we value it enough to put everything else aside, sometimes, not every waking minute, but if we're brave enough sometimes to stop chasing happiness just for a short time each day, if we're willing to recognize that actually there's nothing missing and that we're a part of everything and everyone, then we get a taste of freedom. We get to love our life. We get to love our existence. And of course, loving our existence means accepting ourselves and others and all of it, the whole thing. Restlessness and craving tend to arise when it feels like something's missing. Sometimes something really is missing. Maybe sometimes we're hungry or we're exhausted or cold. Sometimes we need to go looking for a solution, or it might be about something higher up in the hierarchy of needs, like love and connection or fulfillment or so on. A lot of the time, though, I think maybe most of the time, there's nothing missing. And yet, despite the fact that there's nothing missing, that restless energy continues to flow. So expecting pleasant feelings to remain stable and to stick around for a long time just means fighting against reality. You're bound to be disappointed because everything that arises passes, everything changes, feelings change, often within a few seconds, and everything flows from everything else. And yet still, we react as though our life depended on it. And it is easy to say, relax, there's nothing missing from this moment, and it can be much harder to accept it. But that's something that we can train ourselves to do through meditation. Just by finding a moment when we don't have to attend to anything, and simply sitting or walking. And we can take a few deep breaths and slow down and sense into the subtle textures and energies of the body and the feeling of the breath moving in and out of the body. And if we just simply allow all of that to happen without interfering, if we just observe how they're just constantly changing and shifting, we realize the extent to which we're not solid, we're process. So often we'll notice restlessness or craving, maybe intrusive thoughts. And when that happens, all we have to do is acknowledge whatever is going on and smile and allow it to fade in its own time, and then return to the simple, raw sense of being alive, that sense of aliveness, and just resting within that and simply being, and knowing that the simple purity of being is enough, that the present moment is perfect just as it is, and there's no need to go looking for anything else because nothing is missing. So that's it for today. Thank you for listening.